Okay, so apparently I exceeded the limit of how long I can make a video before my phone just cuts me off. So we're just going to try to piece the two of them together. There may be some that you have to read on your own. But basically, where I left off, he was describing what the street would have looked like. Just how busy it would have been with the people trying to sell stuff, the grocers and the poulterers out there trying to sell stuff. And how the mayor, in spite of it being all foggy and icky and everything, would try to keep everything all Christmassy and full of cheer. And he even forgave somebody who had put it in prison last week. Foggier yet and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. The good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that. Instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But the fair sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay." Yes, I can't sing. Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more frost. So here we see again, just describing how cold it is, nipping at your nose, as the song goes, the cold was, and seeing once again just how nasty and mean Scrooge is. He doesn't want anybody singing Christmas carols anywhere near him and his shop, because they were coming up to the shop and singing. At length the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tactfully admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. In other words, he's like, "Okay, fine, you can go home." "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used. I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill, and the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blind Man's Bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers, and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard, where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house playing at hide-and-seek with other houses and had forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was faint to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sent mournful meditation on the threshold. In other words, it's dark, it's foggy, it's gloomy, and it's cold. Now it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker of the door, except it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy or imagination about him as any man in the city of London. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow, as the other objects in the yard were, but a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned upon its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously starred as if by a breath of hot air, and though their eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That, in its livid color, made it horrible. But its horror seemed to be in spite of the face, and beyond its control rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. So in other words, the knocker was a knocker, and then all of a sudden it's Marley's face, with his glasses on top of his head, his hair all blown about, looking all pale and scary and creepy, and then all of a sudden it's a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, nor that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. In other words, he was a little scared. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and the nuts that held the knocker on, so he said, "Pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs slowly, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs or through a bad young Act of Parliament, but I mean to say you might have got a hearse up that staircase and taken it broadwise with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that and room to spare, which was perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. So in other words, it's really, really dark, the staircase that Scrooge is going up, and he thinks he saw a hearse going up the staircase to his house. But this is Scrooge. He's not going to get all excited or admit he's scared. Up Scrooge went, not caring for a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa. Small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head. Upon the hob, nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet. Nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual, old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds. Abraham's, Belshazzar's, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet, that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thought, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. "Humbug!" said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. So in other words, there's this bell that used to be used to get people's attention in another part of building, probably servants' quarters. They probably had servants' quarters in there before. It was now with great astonishment and a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the cask in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight toward his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when without a pause it came on through the heavy door. Remember, he had double-locked this heavy door, and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassel on the latter bristling like his pigtails, and his coat skirts and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound around him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. Nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous and fought his senses. Now, this is one of my favorite scenes from the movie, because in the movie it shows it wrapped around his head. It's like they put a piece of cloth and put it up around this way and tied it up at the top. And so when Scrooge says, "How now," said Scrooge, caustic as cold as ever, "what do you want with me?" Marley reaches up and unties that and drops that cloth down, and when he does, when it's closed, his mouth looks like this. When he unties it, his mouth does this. Because apparently all this starts to decay when you're a corpse rotting. We kind of talked about that when we talked about Egypt and burial practices with Joseph. And so his jaw just drops. And then he says, "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say "to a shade," but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your own senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of detracting his own attention, and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To it, staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of his own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case. For though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were as still agitated, as by the hot vapor from an oven. In other words, things around him, his clothes were moving. You see this toothpick, said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from him. I do, replied the ghost. You're not looking at it. But I see it, said the ghost. Well, returned Scrooge, I have but to swallow this and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins. Humbug, I tell you, humbug. In other words, he's proving his point. He eats something he shouldn't, he could be seeing ghosts. Well, at this, the spirit raised a frightful cry. It shook its chains with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon, from fainting. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round his head, as if it were too warm to wear, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. Mercy, he said, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind, replied the ghost, do you believe in me or do you not? I do, said Scrooge, I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why come to me? It is required of every man, the ghost returned, that the spirit within him should walk among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turn to happiness. Again the spectre raised a cry, and shook its chain, and wrung its shadowy hands. You are fettered, said Scrooge, trembling. In other words, you're upset. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost, and made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is it patterned strange to you? Scrooge trembled more and more. Or would you know, pursued the ghost, the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable. But he saw nothing. Jacob, he said imploringly. Oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me. I have none to give, the ghost replied. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. Very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his pants pocket. Wondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but not without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. You must have been very slow about it, Jacob, Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference. Slow? The ghost repeated. 7 years dead, mused Scrooge, and traveling all the time? The whole time, said the ghost. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. You travel fast, said Scrooge. On the wings of the wind, replied the ghost. You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years, said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. O captive bound in double iron, cried the phantom, not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunities misused. Yet such was I, oh, such was I. But you were always such a good man of business, faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. Business, cried the ghost, wringing its hand. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. It held up its chain at arm's length as if that were the cause of all its unveiling grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. In other words, Jacob is saying, yeah, I was good at business like you're thinking, making money, but that's not what's important. What's important is taking care of people. And because I didn't do that in life, that's why I'm now stuck as a ghost wandering around with this major chain on me. And you've got the same chain, but you're not going to see it until you're dead, stuck wandering, dragging this chain around. All of this, at this time of the rolling year, the specter said, I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. Hear me, cried the ghost, my time is dearly gone. I will, said Scrooge, but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray. How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell. Set invisible before you many and many a day. It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. That is no light part of penance, pursued the ghost. I am here tonight to warn you that you have a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and a hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You always were a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Think ye. You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits. Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost had done. Is that the chance and the hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice. It is. I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge. Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over with, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us. When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it around its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an attitude with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear. From the raising of the hand, he became sensible of confused noises in the air, and incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrow and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out onto the bleak night. So in other words, there's a whole bunch of ghosts out there, and they're all wailing and moaning, and Jacob joins them, and Scrooge hears this. You got just a little bit. I want you to finish reading by yourself. I'm about to run out of time on this video too. Remember, after you've read the last little couple of paragraphs by yourself, do the stave 1 quiz, definitely. Then I would go ahead and be working on the cause and event. You know, the first cause is Fred wishes Scrooge Merry Christmas and invites him to dinner. The effect is Scrooge says what? He says, bah humbug. Then, the second one is the people came collecting money. What did Scrooge do? That's what you're going to type for 2. 1, 2, and 3 go with chapter 1 or stave 1. Don't turn it in though. You're not going to hit the turn in button until they're all done. But the cause and event's not due to the 17th. The vocab, which is open dictionary, isn't due to the 17th. The actual stave 1 quiz is due next Thursday, because I already had you turning it, but no, it's due tomorrow. Sorry, it's due on Friday. So see you tomorrow when we pick up with stave 2.